Kia ora te whānau. It's good to be with you today and to share this service together. Last year when we were heading into Global Week, we spent a little bit of time looking at the Old Testament story of Jonah. And this year, as we're heading into Global Week, we're going to look at the Old Testament story of Esther. They're both stories that tell us about God's heart for the whole world and God including people in what he wants to do in the world and what he wants to do for other nations and peoples, and Jonah's reluctance and some people's reluctance in the story of Esther as well. They're both great stories, they're captivating stories, they're stories that can't drag you in and they've got interesting characters, they're stories that have got a plot and irony and humour, and they're set in different settings. And in this case, in the Esther story, there's a really happy ending. And the story ends with that kind of living happily ever after, or at least a hint of that, as they celebrate the Festival of Purim. It's a festival which the Jews still celebrate today, 2,500 years later. And you can see in this picture, on the 9th of March this year, they were celebrating Purim, and how that was celebrated in Israel and across the world by the Jewish communities. And so that's where the book's going to end. But before that, there's a great story. A story where we learn a little bit about how God is at work. God at work in then the biggest empire, the Persian Empire of the world. And what God wants to do then, God's still doing today, and seeking to redeem, to rescue, to be alongside people, to draw individuals and communities and nations back to himself. As Jesus said, he didn't come to destroy the Old Testament law or the Old Testament account, but he came to fulfill it. And so as we look at Esther, we start to see the framework in which Jesus' life and ministry, death and resurrection makes sense. The framework for the book of Esther is 10 great banquets, 10 great feasts. And as I've said, it ends with a feast. But most of the action happens around these 10 feasts that shape the whole of the book. At the time of this story, the king was Xerxes. He was king of Persia. We're told in the opening chapter there's 127 provinces in Persia. And this map, which shows in the green the extent of the Persian Empire, it would take in today northwest India, Pakistan, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Israel, northern Greece, northern Turkey, Egypt, Ethiopia, and northern Sudan. It was a vast empire. It was the greatest empire of its time. And it's in that context that this story rolls out. The Prime Minister is one of the key players, and his name is Haman. He's not a Persian, but he's an outsider. He's an Agagite, after the king Agag, whose story is told in 1 Samuel 15. For our purposes, just to know that there's a great animosity, hatred, and real dislike between his people and the Jewish people. And he kind of inherits that prejudice and that anger. And when Mordecai, a Jewish official, a low-level official, way down the pecking order of Haman, refuses to bow to him, it really gets under Haman's skin. If we look at the passage in Esther chapter 3 and verse 2, it says, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour. And this gets under his skin. The passage goes on, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. The fact he wouldn't do it, he wanted to kill the guy. But not only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, when a lot was cast. It was cast in the presence of Haman. Haman organised for this lot to be cast, to pick a day and a month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. And on that month, Haman wanted to kill, not just Mordecai, but all the Jews of this vast Persian empire. Chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, there's a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire, who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it's not in the king's interest to let them live. This is the basis on which he wants an edict to be sent out all over the Persian Empire, declaring that on this certain day, the day when the lot was cast, all of the Jews were to be killed. And he needed the king's permission, the king's right to do that. And he doesn't tell the king which people, he just tells them a people. Anyway, Haman, as the prime minister, sends out this edict. And it goes on the postal system of the Persian Empire, which is well renowned, all across the empire. It would have taken about 3 months to get there, and set a date 11 months from the time that it was sent, when all the Jews were to be killed. Now let's pick up the story in Esther chapter 5. Haman's been to a banquet, one of the 10 banquets that shape this book. And at the banquet, the queen, Esther, has entertained him and the king. It says Haman went away out of that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. It tells us a lot about Haman and what he's like. What enraged him was that somebody wouldn't show him deference. You know, small people with small agenda and small passion and small picture, are upset by small things. And Haman's an example of that. He wasn't enraged by big injustices or concerns of the world or what was happening to others. He was enraged because his pride was slighted by one person who, because of his religious beliefs, wouldn't bow to him. Let's carry on. Verse 9. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honoured him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow, another banquet. But all this gives me no satisfaction, as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. We see Haman's heart. Haman's heart is filled with an idol, and the idol is I. It's himself. It's self-centeredness. He's centered on his wealth, his power, being honoured by the king, being elevated in position, being the only person the queen invited to a banquet with herself and the king. But he also says that gave him no satisfaction while Mordecai was still there. He was easily slighted because the centerpiece, the God of his life, was himself. And when that was questioned, that was insulted, he got so upset. He's not alone. So many people in our world 2,500 years ago in the Persian time and today in our world in New Zealand or anywhere else are exactly the same. Maybe I am, you are. Our gods ourselves. And we're after wealth and honour and elevation and position and a whole lot of those sorts of things. And we're hurt when our pride, our status, our position is questioned or marred. Now, it's not that from a biblical perspective we don't matter. We do. You matter. I matter. Self is important. But self in relationship to God. Self in relationship to the big picture of what God is doing in the world. And self in relationship to God's love and God's compassion for us and for others. It's not that we don't matter, but we matter in a much bigger picture. Let's carry on with the story to find out more of that. Haman likely had this grudge with Mordecai because of their family history. It's a sad thing when a grudge, a hurt, a hatred lingers in us for a long time, particularly generationally. And this has lingered in Haman and it affects his position. Far better to name it, ask forgiveness and move beyond it. But Haman didn't. So let's pick up the story. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up reaching to the height of 50 cubits. That's about 22.5 meters. It's a massive pole. It's a high pole. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Now, there's a backstory. And to get the next thing that's going to happen in the main trunk of the story, we've got to understand the backstory. King Xerxes had some servants who wanted to kill him. They were going to have an assassination attempt on his life. And Mordecai, the Jew, the low official who sat at the gate outside the city of Susa, heard about that. And he took that news to his cousin, who was the Queen Esther. She'd been married to the king. And he told her there was this threat against the king's life. And so she went and told the king, and the assassination attempt was stopped and the king was saved. And it was written up in the annals of the time, but Mordecai was never acknowledged or thanked or noted. Anyway, the night before Queen Esther's banquet, the second of her banquets with Haman and her husband the king couldn't sleep. And so he asked for one of his readers to come and read to him from the memorials of the time, the annals of what was happening, the memorial deeds of his empire. And the page that the reader decided to read from was the page where it talked about Mordecai, who found out about this assassination attempt and who told Esther, and Esther told the king, and it was stopped. And the king, listening to that story, said, was Mordecai ever thanked? Was he ever recognised? Was he ever acknowledged for actually saving my life? And the reader said no. And in verse 4 it says, at that very moment that Haman arrived in the court of the king. Haman couldn't sleep either. Haman was up early because he wanted to come to the king and ask for the king's permission to have Mordecai killed, impaled on the pole that he had set up in his backyard. And so he came to the king at the same time. The king sees him and he asks a question. Well, the attendant answered, Haman is standing in your court, he says. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king answered him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honour? And Haman thought, the king wants to honour me. Of course he wants to honour me. It's all about me. I'm focused on me. This is all that matters in my world. So surely if the king wants to honour someone, the one that the king's going to want to honour is me. Let's read on. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honour than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. And Haman was thinking it's going to be for me. So in the next verse the king says, go at once. Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested. And Haman's delighted. And then the king carries on, for Mordecai the Jew. It wasn't for Haman. The person the king is going to honour and respect in this way is Mordecai, his arch enemy. Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate, do not neglect anything you have recommended. And now imagine it. Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. This was a horrendous day. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. At the previous banquet, the king had promised Esther anything she wanted, up to half his kingdom. And now in the second banquet, as the second day of feasting and eating and drinking, she comes to the king with her request. And her request is this, that her and her people would be spared. That the decree that had gone out across the whole empire to kill and to annihilate and to destroy the Jews wouldn't be enacted. And Haman must have thought something's wrong, because he wrote this. And the word destroyed, annihilated and killed were the very words that he had written in the decree that was sent out across the Persian Empire. And the king became angry. And he says, who is he? Where is he that dares to do such a thing? And Queen Esther pointed and said, the foe and the enemy is Haman, sitting right here at the meal. The king steps out. He doesn't know what to do. He's angered, he's furious, but he doesn't know how to react when his prime minister is the culprit. And so he goes into his garden, and Haman begs Esther that she would speak on his behalf, that she'd say something positive to the king, that he might be given a reprieve. And then, as he's speaking with Queen Esther, he falls onto her couch just at the moment that the king comes in. This whole story is full of twists and turns and irony. And just as the king comes back in, he sees Haman sitting on the couch of the queen and thinks, he's even after my wife, not just my horse and my robe and my signet ring and my power, but even my wife. And the guy who's next to him, Harbonah, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. The twist and the turn about Haman thinking he would be honoured and ended up being Mordecai. Haman thinking he would kill on this very pole Mordecai, and he ends up being impaled on the very pole that he had put up in his backyard. A story of twists and turns. Mordecai and Esther create with the king another edict. They can't overturn and to change the edict which has been sent across this vast empire, but they can send a second edict, giving the Jews the right to stand up for themselves and to fight against anyone who tries to kill them on the day at which this purge is to happen. And God intervenes through that edict, and the Jews survive. And those who attack them are destroyed, and the people of God are delivered. And that's why in chapter 8 they celebrate. And there is this festival. Their sorrow has been turned into joy, their mourning into celebration. And they feast and they celebrate in the actions of the Festival of Purim. Our deliverance is the same. It may come quietly. It may seem like God is not at work. But God is seeking to deliver and bring freedom and life for every one of us. And God has already enacted that. 2,500 years ago, God rescued these people, the Jews, in the Persian Empire. And 500 years later, Jesus came. And on the day of Purim, the day before the Passover, Jesus died and rose again to set us all free from the enemies of death and sin and destruction that others would want to impart, steal from our lives. One of the parts of the Festival of Purim is that they celebrate by being generous. As they celebrate that God has rescued them, they share their food and their produce with the poor, the widows, the fatherless, the sojourner, the refugees, and the Levites in their midst, so that everyone can celebrate. Not just the wealthy have salmon and blue cheese, but everyone gets the salmon and blue cheese at Purim. It is the loudest and most celebratory, most joyful of all the Jewish festivals, because it remembers that remarkable reprieve of God. In this story, we learn through the character of Haman. Haman, who lived a life of idolatry, who had an idol, and the idol for Haman was I. It was all about himself. He didn't see the needs of others, and he didn't seek the concern of others. He didn't see the needs of the king, and he didn't seek the work of the king, but rather he was completely focused on himself. And that turns against him. Paul, when he writes in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians, says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich." God works the exactly opposite way to Haman, and he calls us to work in exactly the opposite way to Haman. Instead of seeking after our own good, he calls us to seek after the good of others. Instead of trying to elevate ourselves, he calls us to humble ourselves. Instead of trying to gain and attain wealth and power and control, he says to give away or to use wealth and power and control for the sake of our neighbour, for the sake of others, following in the footsteps of Jesus. And so Jesus, 500 years after Haman, comes and he says to us all, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What does that mean? That Jesus comes as our deliverer. God quietly delivered the people in Mordecai's and Esther's day. And God delivers now through Jesus Christ, his Son. And Jesus calls us all to come to him. And we can choose to come, or we can stay away and become focused or remain focused on ourselves. But if we come, what will happen? What will happen, Jesus says, is he will put his yoke on our shoulders. A yoke is the bridle of an ox that's pulling a plough through a field. It means that we take on Jesus' lordship. He becomes Lord, boss, CEO in our lives. We take on our shoulders his leadership. We will follow him. And secondly, we'll learn from Jesus. We'll allow him to teach us and to shape us and to grow us. And as we do that, letting him be Lord in our lives, coming towards him and learning from him, we realize that he is gentle and humble, that we will find rest for our souls, and that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And that was the experience of Mordecai and Esther, that God came through for them. And in the end, they celebrate the goodness, the love, the forgiveness, and the life of God. My prayer as we go into communion is that we all choose to come to Jesus, to allow him to put his yoke on us and to learn from him, and to learn and to know it is the best way to live. Thanks for listening.